Feel like we should sing Light the Fire or something. I know what you're thinking. With all the rain, how did he find dry enough wood to start that fire, right? It's just a Sunday miracle, I guess. We're glad you're here today. We're in a sermon series looking at someone we read about in the New Testament, looking at the transformation that takes place in the life of Simon Peter. And Peter's perspective gives us a wonderful lens through which to view the central figure of the New Testament, and that is Jesus Christ, the one that we claim as Lord, the one who, as Will reminded us, walked among us and died for us and was raised to life. But when we look at Jesus through the eyes of Peter and through the life and the character and the ups and downs of Peter, we are able to connect, aren't we? Because Peter is so relatable. I find myself so often when I read the story of Peter saying something he shouldn't have said, or being impulsive, or doing something that maybe he thought was right, but it really wasn't. So his life was filled with ups and downs. When we look at the text, we see Peter leave a boat 2 different times to join Jesus. Once to join Jesus and to follow him as a fisher of people. And once he left a perfectly good boat to walk out on the open water toward Jesus, who was walking on the water. We've seen Peter on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, proclaiming that Jesus has the words of eternal life, this high point in Peter's life. We've also seen Peter in the upper room declaring that he would forever be faithful to Christ. That even if it meant dying with and dying for Jesus, that he was with Jesus. And now when we catch up with Peter, we see him warming himself by a fire in the courtyard of the high priest. And of course, this is where Peter will do what he is probably most known for: his threefold denial of Jesus. But just for a moment, let's back up and see how he gets there. Because just a few hours earlier, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, along with his disciples. And a mob of Jewish leaders comes to take Jesus away. They are determined not to leave the garden unless Jesus is in their custody. And they are more determined to remove Jesus completely, because he is a threat to their social standing, to their religious security. Well, Peter would have none of this. He would defend his friend, his rabbi, the one he had pledged his life to. And so he wields his sword and ends up cutting off the ear of one of the servants, one of the guards. Jesus quickly puts an end to the violence. Put your sword away. And he heals the man's ear. And he allows that mob of Jewish leaders to take him away. And now Peter finds himself in no man's land. What is he supposed to do now? Where is he supposed to go? He's in that middle ground, that no man's land. He's too afraid to join Jesus, but he's too curious to leave him. And so he follows Jesus at a distance. And that's where we pick up the story in John's Gospel, chapter 18, starting in verse 15. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. Verse 17. You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? She asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing there with them, warming himself. Maybe Peter wasn't prepared for the question. Maybe it was just an impulsive reaction. Maybe he was just trying to save his skin. But when confronted with that question, aren't you with Jesus? Peter said, no, I am not. What happened to those good intentions? What happened to that pledge to die with, to die for Jesus? What happened to all of that? What I have found to be true in life is that when the heat is turned up, good intentions often melt away. I think Peter wanted to do the right thing. I think that's why he drew his sword. He was misguided, but he wanted to do the right thing. He didn't want Jesus to leave him or for him to disown Jesus. And yet, the pressure was so great. When he was confronted with that question, aren't you with Jesus? Don't you follow him? Aren't you a disciple of this man Jesus? All Peter could do was deny it. It's interesting when you see this story, and especially in John's gospel, Peter is being interrogated. At the same time, Jesus is being questioned. He's being interrogated. While Peter is being asked about his association with Jesus, Jesus is being asked about his association with these disciples and about what he's teaching. Maybe the high priest wants to flush out his disciples and take them down when he takes Jesus down. Maybe he just wants to know who they are so he can ask them to say something against Jesus, to indict Jesus. So now the high priest has something on Jesus. Whatever the case, Jesus won't give them up. Nor will he give up his true identity and his true purpose. Even when, and you look at your text, this happens, and you know this, even when they strike him, beat him, ultimately kill him. I don't think it's a mistake that these narratives are in parallel with each other, because we see the contrast there between Jesus and Peter. Jesus is firm and immovable. Peter is weak and timid. And as Jesus is being questioned and mistreated, Peter begins to again face the heat, face the fires of the pressure, putting his faith in the crosshairs, putting his own allegiance to Jesus in question. Let's pick up the story in verse 25. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there, warming himself. So they asked him, "You aren't one of these disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." 26, one of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow. And Matthew tells us in his gospel that Peter, in that moment, realizing what he has done, weeps bitterly. 3 confrontations, 3 opportunities, 3 denials. This story is so remarkable and so regrettable and so relatable that it is included in all 4 gospel accounts. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell the agonizing story of Peter denying Jesus. And when you look at Matthew's account in chapter 26, you see something very interesting and I think all too familiar. You see this progression of Peter's denial that takes place. Peter is asked, "Aren't you with Jesus? Aren't you with him? Aren't you a follower of Jesus?" And in Matthew chapter 26, verse 70, we're told that Peter denies it in front of everyone. All eyes are staring at Peter. He has to say something. He has to have some response. And so he just denies it in front of everyone. It's almost like he's trying to play it off. "No, I'm not with him." "Who? That guy? I don't even know that guy." "No." I mean, it doesn't seem that blatant, right? He simply just denies knowing Jesus, denies following him. It's just a little white lie, right? But then you know what happens. He's asked again, "No, wait a second, aren't you one of his followers?" In verse 72, we're told that Peter makes an oath and denies Jesus. Stronger language. Jesus had said, and Peter heard him say this, not to make oaths. Simply let your yes be yes, let your no be no. But see, stronger language is needed here. Why? Because Peter has chosen this path. He's chosen this road, and he can't turn back now. There is too much at stake. He is risking too much social capital, maybe even his own life, and so he makes an oath. Well, he's asked again, a third time. Don't you follow Jesus? Aren't you with him? And in verse 74 in Matthew's gospel, we see what happens. Peter calls down curses, denying association with Jesus. The translation is interesting there. Your version may say something a little bit differently, because when someone curses, there's always an object. You curse someone or you curse something. Your version might say that Peter cursed himself. The harsh reality is there's a good chance that Peter cursed Jesus. To completely disassociate himself with Jesus. You see the progression? It's all too familiar, isn't it? You see, that is the nature of sin, especially sin that is wrapped in pride and rooted in fear. It causes us to not stay in one place, but to continually rebel against God and God's will. We choose that path, and once we take a few steps, well, we can't turn back now. I'm in too deep. And so I continue to lie. I continue to deceive. I continue to cover up. Maybe you know what that's like. Peter certainly knew what it was like, because that's what he did. As Peter was standing by the fire that night, his faith facing the intense heat of direct confrontation, I wonder if he, at that moment or any moment after that, I wonder if he remembered Jesus' words of warning from earlier. In Matthew chapter 10, we see what we call the limited commission. In Matthew 28, we have the Great Commission. His disciples, including us, are supposed to go into all the world and make disciples. But in Matthew chapter 10, it's the limited commission. Jesus sends out the 12 apostles to the lost sheep of Israel, just to the Jewish people. And he gives them an important message. And the message is this: tell them the kingdom of heaven is near. The kingdom of heaven is upon us. It is arriving, which means it's arriving in the form of Jesus. What they have long waited for, what they have been looking for, the kingdom being revealed on earth, it's happening. As Jesus walks among them and reveals to them the truth about the kingdom of God. But Jesus tells those 12 when he sends them out, he says, don't take anything with you. Wait a second, Jesus? Nothing? Not a carry-on bag? Not a charger for my phone? What am I supposed to do? No, you don't take anything with you except a complete reliance upon God. But that's not all. Jesus says, you need to know that when you go out there, many of the people, they're going to reject your message. They're not going to agree with what you're telling them. In fact, they're going to target you. You are going to be like sheep among wolves, he says. And then he tells them this, to remind them how important this is, to remind them who they are, to remind them whose they are. In Matthew 10, verse 32, he says, whoever acknowledges me before others, I will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. I wonder if Peter ever thought about those words. Maybe that's why he wept bitterly. Acknowledging Jesus before others. That's what Jesus called them to do when they went out into the world. Acknowledge Jesus in front of others. Make much of Jesus. Make him known. It's the same thing that he's called us to do. To acknowledge him before others. Well, that's not always easy, is it? Yeah. Now, here at church, it's a lot easier than it is at school, right? because these are generally like-minded people. People on the pew sitting next to you, they generally think like you do. It's a little bit easier when you're at church camp to acknowledge Jesus. Everyone's caught up in the emotion of Jesus, and that's why we're there. It's a little bit easier to acknowledge Jesus in your family if there are a lot of Christians in your family. But what about when it's not easy? What about when it's going to cost you something? What about when something is on the line, something near and dear to you? Then what do you do? You see, the fires, the flames, the heat comes in many different forms. Social pressure, worrying about what people will say or think of me, or the potential loss of a job or hurting your career. Or maybe it's making the wrong decision, or it's not standing up for what is right, or whatever the case may be. What do you do when it's not easy to acknowledge Jesus among others? I read a story recently of a young college professor. He was at a state university several years ago, and he was a believer, a Christian, and one of the older, more experienced faculty members knew this about this young man. And so one day he approached him and he said, you probably want to just keep that to yourself. He said, if you make that known on campus, that's only going to hurt your career, hurt your chances for tenure. You really should probably just keep that a secret. That young professor was so impressionable. He thought about that. And one day he was walking across campus, and there, in a very prominent place on campus, was a flyer. And he noticed on this flyer, his picture was on it, and his name was on it. It was a flyer that a local church had posted on campus, featuring him as a speaker at one of their campus ministry events, and they were promoting it. And he saw that flyer, and he remembered those words from that older professor. You know what he did? Not in that moment, but later that night, under the cover of dark, he came back on campus, and he pulled that poster down. But the next morning, after several hours of soul searching and prayer, he went back on campus and he put it back up. He said, I realized in that moment what my life was really all about. It wasn't about my career ambition. It was about being a faithful disciple of Jesus Christ. That having a secret faith is really having no faith at all. He said, it dawned on me that when you live for an audience of one, that it removes the pressure. Rather than living for an audience of people at work, or your boss, or your classmates, or your professors, or your girlfriend, or your boyfriend, or whoever it might be, the world. When we live for that audience, we're always competing, we're always promoting ourselves, we're always trying to get one more step up. He said, when you realize that you're living for an audience of one, it just removes the pressure. That God is the one that you're living for. We can relate, can't we? I think so often we know what it's like to face those fires, whatever form those fires come in. We are in a public place, we are among other people, and our faith is put in the crosshairs. Will we pledge allegiance to Christ, or will we deny Him? Take something as simple as praying in public. Now, praying in public is not commanded in the Bible. Thou shalt pray before thine self enjoy the chips and queso at lunch, right? That's not in the Bible. Although if you ever had to pray a prayer of thanksgiving for something, I think chips and queso would qualify. That's not a commandment in the Bible. It's not a sin if you don't pray in public. In fact, you could maybe make a case based on Scripture that you shouldn't necessarily pray in public, but rather go into your closet. And that's maybe a different discussion. But let me say this. If you don't pray in public, or don't claim your Christianity among others because you are worried about what they will think of you or what they will say of you, then maybe you need to reassess your priorities. Maybe you need to take a long look inside yourself and see what audience it is you're living for. We know what it's like. We have all found ourselves face to face with the fires of this world. Social pressure can be so strong, political pressure so strong, the fear of losing a job or losing something else that is near and dear to you. What do you do in those situations? I think it's true that we either let the fires of this life ruin our faith, or we allow them to refine our faith. And really the choice is yours. All these fires you face, hard times, difficult times, severe loss, social pressure, persecution, whatever it is, you have a choice in that. Do you allow these things to ruin your faith or to refine your faith? When you are confronted with that question, hey, don't you belong to Jesus? You have a choice to make in that moment. Do you say, yes, absolutely. He is my Lord and my Savior, and I am by His side? Or do you say, like Peter, no way. I curse him. It's important to remember that these experiences, these decisions, these moments facing the fires, they aren't just isolated experiences. They are rather part of an unfolding story, your story. You see, I believe who we are when no one's looking prepares us for who we will be when we face the fires of life. Right before Peter was by the fire denying Jesus, Jesus took him and James and John to the Garden of Gethsemane. And he said, sit there and watch while I go into the garden and pray. And Jesus, after a while, comes back, and rather than praying, what are they doing? What is Peter and the other guys doing? They are sleeping. And Jesus says, watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. Matthew 26:41. Watch and pray so you will not fall into temptation. Have you ever read that passage and wondered, what's the context for that? What temptation is Jesus talking about? It doesn't really seem to fit, does it? What's he talking about there? He says the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. 3 different times Jesus comes back. And rather than watching and praying, Peter and the others are doing what? They are snoozing. The flesh is indeed weak. 3 times. Does that sound familiar? I don't think it's a mistake that in the gospel narrative, we're told that this happens 3 times, that Jesus rebukes them 3 times. And then what do you know? Peter denies Jesus how many times? 3 times. There's a connection there. Maybe that was a temptation Jesus was referring to. Maybe if Peter and the others would have spent more time praying and watching and preparing, he would have been ready for the confrontation. He would have been ready for the temptation at the fire. See, the truth is, it's the condition of our faith that is brought to light when there is fire. It's the condition of our faith. Until your faith is tested, do you really know if you have faith? Well, I go to church. Well, that's great. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have faith. Until your faith is put to the test, until it goes through the flames and the fires of persecution and hardship and adversity and doubt, then there's a good chance you don't even know if you have faith. I had a friend and a mentor who faced a fire, literally faced a fire. There was a wildfire approaching his house, and you know how our Oklahoma winds are. Boy, it was on him in a heartbeat, and so he was able to get his wife out and their dogs and just a few possessions. But the house was considered a complete loss. They were displaced from their house for several months. What do you do in a situation like that? Maybe some of you have been through something like that. How do you respond? How does that impact your faith? I remember sitting across a table at a Chili's restaurant from this man and listening to him talk about the impact that fire, that literal fire, had on him and on his faith. And this is a man of great faith, but he talked about how disorienting it was, how unprepared for it he was, not just physically, protecting the house, but spiritually and emotionally. And he was really wrestling with how to handle this fire and how to make a good choice coming out of that and to honor God through that. And later he said this, and he wrote this down. He said, "We need an authentic faith language that will enable us to stay in relationship with God by speaking the truth out of our chaotic, crushed lives to God, and at the same time do it with reverent submission." We need a language to speak about God, to speak to God. Yes, as we read in that welcome verse early in our service, God will walk with us through the fires. But that's not the time to be quiet. That's not the time to take a back seat. That is the time to make our faith known, to speak out, to acknowledge Jesus to others. Peter, the man who stood by the fire and denied Jesus 3 times, later wrote these words in 1 Peter chapter 1. "In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief and all kinds of trials, all kinds of fires. These have come so that the proven genuineness, the realness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in the praise and glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." It's the same man who stood by that fire, later said, "It is the fire that refines your faith, the realness of your faith." He knows what he's talking about. You see, the fire exposes our faith, doesn't it? And we have a choice to make. We can let those fires in life ruin our faith, or we can allow them to refine our faith. Allow God to use those fires to shape our character, to transform us as he did transform Peter. And so the question is, how will you respond? When you face the fires, what will you say? When your faith and your trust and your allegiance to Christ is put on the table, along with so many other things that you value, your job, your career, your relationship with someone, what people think of you, your image, what people might say to you, how they might treat you, how will you respond? Hey, aren't you with Jesus? When someone asks you that, how will you answer? This isn't the last time that we will see Peter warming himself by a fire. There's an interesting detail in John's gospel about the fire that I think links it to another fire later. A fire where we see Peter and another confrontation, this time with Jesus himself. I hope you'll be here next Sunday. It's Easter Sunday. I hope that you will be here, and I hope that you will welcome guests with us and make them feel right at home, and I hope that you want to hear the story about what happens to Peter at that fire. A wonderful story of grace and mercy and restoration. See, that's your story as well. And so today, as we close our time together, the question still lingers. How will you respond? What will you do? Maybe today you need help on the journey. Maybe you need help having the courage and the faith to make the right response. If we can lift you up in prayer, we'd be happy to do that. Or maybe today you're ready to give your life to Christ, to acknowledge that Jesus is Lord, that He's the Son of God, to claim Him as your own, and to be buried in the waters of baptism, to come up living this new life, a life of hope and peace and joy and purpose, the best life there is, the life you were created to live. Maybe today is your day. We're going to stand and sing. We'll have a couple of shepherds and their wives in the parlor right behind me. They'd be happy. I can assure you, they'd be happy to receive you and pray for you and encourage you. Or you can come down to the front today as we stand and sing.